All right, well, we're at about three after, so I am going to go ahead and get us started. We are recording today if folks end up missing the very beginning of the session. But we got a lot to get through, so I'm going to start getting into it. Welcome everybody to this uh, webinar put on by the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition. Today we're going to be talking about the Affordable Housing Tax Credit program and how that can relate to and advance building decarbonization and other priorities of our coalition. My name is Jacob Serfling. I'm the Director of Policy and Projects here at Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition, and glad for so many of you to be able to join us here this afternoon. If you're not a coalition member, but happen to see that this webinar was coming up and chose to join us here today, first off, welcome. Glad you were able to make it. Just a little bit of background on Midwest BDC. Our overall mission is to develop and implement equitable strategies to achieve zero emissions from the Midwest building sector by 2050. And we have 8 states that we primarily focus on: Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio. Although certainly we have coalition members that are national or based in neighboring states that support our work, and we're grateful for them as well. This is just where the bulk of our focus goes. And if you're interested in learning more about Midwest BDC, we encourage you to visit midwestdecarb.org, where you can learn more about the organization, more about our members and how you could become one. And you'll find recordings of other trainings that we have done in the past. To kind of set the stage for today, I wanted to start by looking at the definition of equitable building decarbonization that our coalition uses. And I think you'll see this reflected in the way that we engage with the low-income housing tax credit programs and what we think we can advance through them, and why we focus on them as part of our work here as a coalition. So this is a definition that our equity working group, our members of our organization, drafted for us, defining equitable building decarbonization as to remove the hazard of fossil fuel usage in buildings and facilitate access to carbon-free heating, water heating, and cooking, while prioritizing BIPOC or other intersectional identities in empowering poor, low, and moderate income households and underserved communities with clean technologies and infrastructure. And within that, including equitable outcomes in who produces and who benefits from decarbonizing our communities, and leadership of enterprises by the communities most impacted by the burdens of energy and environmental injustice. So I think you can hear in there a lot in that definition of why we would be looking at affordable housing programs as an avenue to encourage building decarbonization, and also our approach to trying to bring more folks to the table with how we engage with these programs. Just to set the table a little bit more on low-income housing in general, certainly this isn't exhaustive. We could spend a whole hour just going through different housing statistics and things on their own, and I want to get into the nuts and bolts of this specific program. But just to, again, kind of touch on what we're up against and why the low-income housing tax credit program itself even exists. So in a 2022 survey that the National Low Income Housing Coalition did, they sought to do a landscape analysis of all 50 states and determine how many affordable rental units there even were per 100 extremely low income renters in those states. And if you look at the 8 states that Midwest BDC focuses on, the average was somewhere between 35 to 43 units available per 100 renters that fell into that extremely low income category. So right off the bat, we understand that there's just extreme lack of affordable housing in the first place. And certainly the folks that run these developer tax credit programs understand that as well. Then going a bit further, looking at some of the energy aspects of that, we know that the vast majority of rental or renter households are responsible for their own utility bills. Around 90% pay for their own electricity separately from their rent. It's not included in the rent that they pay to the landlord. And 77% of renter households paid for their heat source separately. So, whether that be gas or propane or something else that's not part of their electric bill, not part of their rent, a separate utility bill that they're responsible for paying for to keep their home warm during the winter. So we know that there's not enough of these units. The folks that live in them are probably responsible for paying their own energy bills. And that means that thinking about what those energy bills looks like, how energy efficient or what types of energy they're utilizing is also should be considered part of what makes those units affordable. So this next section, just again, kind of setting the landscape, talks about a concept called energy burden. I would imagine a lot of folks on this call are already familiar with that term, but if you're not, it's pretty simple. Energy burden is a percentage, and you get it by dividing how much your household spends annually on your energy bills, so your electric and gas bill or what have you, and you divide that by the total household income. And you're trying to figure out how much of the money that I take home over the course of the year is going back out to pay for energy. And generally, folks that look at energy burden, they would consider anything over 6% high. And when you get into that 10% range of your household income going towards energy bills, that's considered severe energy burden. And now there's a tool that the U.S. Department of Energy puts out, the Low Income Energy Affordability Data Tool. Really cool kind of map, and you can zero in and filter on some different things. You can see a little bit of a screenshot of that there on the right of the screen. And if you look at the 8 Midwest BDC states that we track for renting households that are in that low income range that these tax credit programs are seeking to serve by building more housing. So they're, anywhere from 60% or lower of the median income of the area where they live. Their energy burdens are ranging from 4% in Minnesota, which doesn't tick up into that high category, but it's still a pretty significant part of take-home income going to energy bills for those households, up to 9% in Michigan. So certainly a lot of the states that we look at, those low income renters are in that high range, and they're really starting to push up against that severe energy burden range. So this is something that needs to be addressed, not just providing more affordable housing, but affordable housing that also isn't saddling the occupants with high or severe energy burden. So that's kind of the background. Now we're going to get into the specific program that we're looking here today. And this is a program that Midwest BDC and our Affordable Housing Working Group have paid very close attention to over the past few years. Excuse me. And that's the Federal Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program. This is a pretty long-standing program. It's existed for almost 40 years now, created as part of the Tax Reform Act in the 80s. And the idea was to encourage more developers to build these types of affordable housing projects make more of these affordable units available to low-income renters. And again, these are federal tax credits, so they're allocated through the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD sets what they consider the affordability standards for projects receiving those credits, and some other standards that projects have to meet to receive them. But it's not directly run by the federal government. Shares of those tax credits are allocated to all 50 states, and then a few cities, New York, Chicago, and DC, I believe, are the three cities that have their own allocation separate from their states. And so those states with their allocation are the ones that run that application process and determine the selection criteria for which specific projects in their states are going to be awarded those tax credits. And the process or scoring rubric, or however you want to think about it, for how they determine what those projects are going to be in their state is called the Qualified Allocation Plan, or QAP. And that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit more here as we go. The other high level thing to understand about the low income housing tax credit program, or you might hear me slipping into just calling it LIHTC as we go, is that these are competitive credits. So there's a set pool of money every year that the state gives out. You're not guaranteed to get it, even if you meet all of the requirements. That's part of why they have this scoring and selection criteria, to make sure that they're picking what the state determines to be the most attractive projects to encourage. And in general, they're going to cover 9% of the project cost. So there's some costs that aren't eligible, but in general, you're going to say, hey, this is the project. Okay, you're going to be selected to receive the tax credit. Here's the overall cost of the project. The tax credits will be for 9% of that. And again, like I said, every state and some of those cities have their own housing finance agency that are the ones running this process, at this selection process. And so you can see here, Illinois Housing Development Authority in Illinois, Indiana Housing and Community Development Authority, Iowa Finance Authority, Minnesota State Housing Authority, Missouri Housing and Development Corporation, Ohio Housing Financing Agency, Minnesota Housing Financing Agency, and Wisconsin Housing and Economic Development Agency. So these are the 8 that we primarily focus on at Midwest BDC, trying to influence how they are running their programs and what they're encouraging through that. So I mentioned before that HUD sets those affordability levels every year for the program, and sets some standards that states have to follow. So at the top of that is giving priority to projects serving the lowest income households and that are going to remain affordable for the longest period of time. So that's the kind of North Star of this program. Everything has to be in service of serving those lowest income households and keeping them affordable for a long period of time. Everything else is kind of secondary to that, in terms of the federal requirements of the program. There's also some preference given to certain qualified census tracts or difficult development areas, where there's a long-term community revitalization plan to specifically try to encourage housing and projects in those areas. So you'll sometimes see things giving a little bit more weight to projects based on those types of locations. And then finally, the HUD and the federal government are going to require states to at least consider 10 different selection criteria as part of their application process. So they have to at least touch on these, how much weight or how they do that selection criteria can vary from state to state, but they have to consider project location. They have to consider the specific needs for certain types of housing in an area. So, is this a place that has an excess of, 1-bedroom apartments, but a real lack of larger units that could house families, things like that. The characteristics of the project, including if it's part of a housing revitalization plan, sponsor characteristics. So are there partnering community organizations or things like that are also attached to the developer of this project, tenant populations with special housing needs, if there's public housing waiting lists, how these projects are going to serve households with children. Are these projects that are intended to be rent to buy and lead to eventual home ownership for the tenants? Obviously, we're interested in that aspect of they have to at least address and on some level the energy efficiency of the project, and then consider if there's any historic nature to the project. So these are the things that the federal government HUD says states have to at least consider as part of their selection criteria. So this next piece kind of gets into why has Midwest BDC and our coalition members chosen to engage with this program? Well, part of that is because beyond those set federal requirements, states have a fair amount of flexibility in how they manage their selection criteria and what they place an emphasis on. So they have flexibility to develop their QAPs and set their own allocation priorities and to place additional requirements on awardees if they so choose, but they have to clearly spell out what those priorities are and specify what criteria they'll use to select those projects competing for it. So in other words, as long as they're meeting HUD's main requirements at the federal level, states can also on their own choose to incentivize or ignore other things as long as they are making it clear to the developers competing for those tax credits that this is a state priority and this is how we're considering if you are in service of that priority. And that can include things like incorporating green building certifications or higher energy efficiency requirements, requiring projects to be electric ready or all electric, incorporating on-site or community renewable energy, how well the projects are located to ensure access to services or transit or jobs or educational opportunities. Is this project addressing urban sprawl or gentrification concerns? Are they using healthy or sustainable building materials? And here's where you can start to see a fair amount of difference in what individual states all have in their qualified allocation plans or QAPs, and where we as a coalition see an opportunity to leverage this program at the state level to encourage things that we think are going to be beneficial in housing to address that high and severe energy burden and ensure that equitable building decarbonization transition by making sure that those things are incorporated into the development of affordable housing in these states. So we mentioned that those priorities and how they're going to impact selection criteria have to be made clear to developers competing for these tax credits. How do state financing agencies utilize the QAP to influence the developers in that way? Well, there's two different ways. One is through putting requirements or points in place. So like I said, the QAP is primarily used for the state financing agency to figure out which projects we want to allocate our pool of tax credits to. So they will have a set of minimum requirements that every project has to meet to even be considered. And then they'll have a series of different points that projects can earn in different categories, such as demonstrating community support or having the project be sited in a desirable neighborhood or things like that. And you can see an example from Iowa's QAP there in the screenshot of how some of those points can be laid out. So one way that the QAP is used to influence developers is by giving points or giving higher levels of points to some of those elements in the project. Giving more points to a project that meets a higher threshold of energy efficiency, or giving more points to a project that says it's going to achieve a certain level of green building certification, or have rooftop solar, or be located near transit, or any of those things. And obviously, developers, when they're putting together their applications, want to score those points because it's going to make it more likely that their project gets those tax credits, and they're really key in a lot of cases to making the financing for that whole project work. Another way that the state financing agencies can influence developers through the QAP and LIHTC process is through something called a basis boost. And in this case, this isn't giving points that make it more or less likely that the project will be selected for tax credits, but it increases that percentage of eligible project costs that the project can receive credits for if they meet a certain criteria. So for instance, if a project is selected, but they also say, I'm going to achieve, LEED silver, a state may say, okay, on top of the regular 9% that you would get for your tax credit, we're going to give you an additional 5% for meeting that certification. So again, with basis boost, it's not making it more or less likely that the project gets any credits at all, but it covers a higher level of the project cost for that. So it's giving more money to projects that do some of those things. So those are the two main avenues that this can be used to influence the type of affordable housing development that happens in the state. And I know it's just me talking, so if folks have questions as we go, feel free to put them in that Q&A section, and I'll pause between slides to see if there's anything that I can answer. Otherwise, we can pick up some of those things at the end too. So what are we seeing in terms of those different points or requirements or basis boost in states? How well are they aligning with Midwest BDC's priorities with regards to building decarbonization? So the National Housing Trust last year actually came out with a really great full 50-state analysis of whatever the current QAP on the books was in all 50 states. And they looked at some different elements to see, what states were doing with them, how many states were doing with them. So kind of in descending order of most common things we're already seeing in terms of third-party green building standards. So things you may have heard of, like LEED certification or Enterprise Green Communities certification or Passive House. 26 out of the 53 housing finance authorities that they looked at required new construction and or rehab projects to achieve some sort of green certification in there. And Midwest BDC states or cities that had that included Chicago and Illinois, Michigan, Minnesota, and Ohio. There was at least some requirement that referenced an existing third-party green certification for all projects that receive tax credits. And then on top of that, most other states have at least maybe it's only 1 or 2 points, but somewhere in their QAP, they're at least mentioning one of those green building standards and putting out a little bit of incentive to it. I will pause there to say that a common complaint that we have heard from developers with that is that they don't really give enough weight to it. It's not enough points to really change the developer's thinking, is what we hear in a lot of cases. And we also frequently see an issue where they'll have one line item of points and they'll just list every type of certification that meets some sort of minimum requirement, and they won't differentiate from them, even if those certifications have wildly, different levels of standards that you would have to meet to do it. Some states like Minnesota do a lot better job of sort of having tiers of things to try to encourage developers to keep moving up that ladder. They'll have a minimum level, that's their requirement, and then you can keep getting more points for different standards that have had more of a demonstrated impact on the tenant's eventual energy bills. So that's one thing. And then still somewhat common across the country are requirements or incentives for incorporating some sort of renewable energy, solar being the most common, but you'll also find mentions of wind or geothermal energy sources into the project. So there are 23 HFAs across the country that currently have a requirement or some sort of incentive to do that. Unfortunately for us here with Midwest BDC, currently only Chicago and Minnesota have any sort of mention of getting renewable energy incorporated into these projects, even just as an optional thing that they would be incentivized with. And then finally, electrification, which those of you who have been through Midwest BDC's Decarb 101 training will know is a key tenet of having decarbonized housing is moving all of those energy fuel sources to all electric. Right now, nationally, there are only 9 HFAs that award points or prioritize all electric projects in some way. And the only Midwest BDC state that has something officially on the books is Minnesota. So, we would probably like to see a lot more of that. I will say that we have recently heard things that a lot of the new construction projects are that participate in LIHTC are already all electric based for other non-QAP reasons that developers have made that decision. So I don't know if that 9 HFAs having that explicitly in their QAP is maybe quite as bleak as it looks on the slide. But that's kind of just an overview of where things are there. So certainly we have enough states that are doing some things that we have proof that the QAP and the low-income housing tax credit program can be a tool to move affordable housing development in a state towards being decarbonized. But we're also seeing that we have a lot of room for improvement for the states that we're looking at to do that better. So how do we impact that? How do we get those things in? How do we influence HFAs to get those numbers up where we would like to see them? So the entities, those housing finance agencies that receive LIHTC allocations, they all will redraft their QAP either annually or biannually. And usually that doesn't mean a completely whole hog new QAP. It's usually a few changes and tweaks every year or every 2 years that they make to the existing one, but they will revisit it and make changes on that 1 or 2 year basis. And because of the rules of the program, they are legally required to have a public hearing and comment period on those proposed changes and drafts that anybody can participate in. You don't have to be a housing developer or anything like that. It can be any sort of advocate or expert from the public that has an interest in this program can comment and make recommendations and make their case to the financing authority on what they think should change in the next QAP. And I will say usually how that works is they'll redraft the QAP for the next year. So right now, any states that are redrafting their QAP in 2024, that's for projects starting to apply for those credits in 2025. They'll do it a year out so that developers kind of know what's coming. And in the case of Minnesota, they actually do theirs 2 years out. So Minnesota will revisit theirs this year in 2024, but that will be for the QAP applications that start in 2026. The final piece that I'll say on that is that while they're required to be public and allow anybody to participate, the emphasis that the HFA puts on publicizing that a new draft is coming and when that public commenting period is starting and how accessible that is can vary significantly from state to state. So some HFAs will give, pretty good heads up to folks that they know will be interested in that about when in the year they should expect it. They may issue a preview document or have a listening session before that first draft even comes out, just to kind of get folks primed to be a part of that discussion. They'll give folks an ample commenting period to review those changes and make comments on it. And then you have the other end of the spectrum, and I'll call them out because you can see it pretty clearly on the slide. Those of you that have been reading that screenshot from our state QAP tracker closely, you have states like Missouri that will drop a draft with no notice and give you, 3 or 4 days to comment on it. So it's meant to be for the public to participate, but you also have to be prepared for it if you're going to engage in the process, I guess is the main point there. Yeah, so much for being the show me state. It's more like a show me what you already decided you were going to do. So with that being said, how do we engage with that? And I'm going to talk a little bit about what Midwest BDC's experience has been engaging with these processes, give you some resources and things to consider if you're thinking about engaging with the LIHTC program and the QAP on your own. Certainly invite you to be a part of our joint efforts with Midwest BDC's Housing Working Group if that's of interest to you after today's session. So the first thing that I want to make sure that folks are aware of, about a year ago now, we had Elevate put together a QAP commenting toolkit for us. That's about I think 6-page PDF that you can find on the Midwest BDC website in that downloadable resources section. It's a lot of what I'm going to be referencing through this next section here. That kind of goes through a lot of the same information I gave about what this program is, how it generally works, why it's something to consider engaging with, and then kind of gives a step-by-step playbook for how you might go about that. So I want to make sure that folks know that that resource is there in addition to this training. And then I'm going to go through those steps that we outline in that toolkit for you all here today. So I recognize affordable housing as a place where we need to decarbonize. I'm fully on board with that. I have learned a lot about what this program is and how it works today, and I'm wanting to influence it. How do I go about doing that? So the first step is gather partners to do it with you. Right? The larger and more diverse list of partners that you can come to the HFA with your comments and recommendations, the more weight it's going to give to them, the larger likelihood of being adopted. Certainly, you're welcome to submit comments as an individual or your organization on your own, but if you can demonstrate that there's fairly broad support for these changes in the program, even better if you can get some actual affordable housing developers in the state to sign on to some of that they would be supportive of some of the changes that you're proposing. It's just going to increase the likelihood of them being adopted. And then once you've got your partners gathered, you're going to want to discuss amongst those stakeholders, what do we actually want to accomplish? And that can start with sort of an initial full-flung brainstorming session of like, if we could get them to have developers do anything we wanted with affordable housing projects, what would they be? And no bad ideas. And then even and they don't have to be super detailed at this point of like, and specifically we want you to incentivize solar by awarding this many points for this types of projects. At this point, you're just trying to identify, is solar something we want to encourage, or are we more interested in all electric or just higher levels of energy efficiency? Figuring out what those actual priorities this group shares first. And I would say typically you want to try to get to the point of around 3 or 4 top priority recommendations, and not maybe an exhaustive laundry list of every little thing that you would like to see with the program. Once you kind of have that rough outline of what you think you're going to want to recommend for changes to the QAP, reach out to the HFA themselves, even outside of that official commenting period. So don't wait for here's the official email where you submit comments or anything like that. Go to those state finance authority websites and kind of figure out who might be a good contact on their staff to reach out to ahead of time, or if you have, that developer or somebody like that in your coalition of partners, they may have contacts at the HFA that are good to reach out to. It's good to know, especially in some of those states that are a little bit more or a little bit less accessible, that you're kind of like on their list of the ones to make sure you even know there's a QAP commenting period coming up, and maybe what the staff is already kind of thinking of changes they think they're going to be proposing, so you already kind of know where their head is at going into the process. And it's just good for developing some long-term relationships there. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is so beneficial here in a little bit. Once you've kind of established that line of communication, the other thing that you can do before that actual commenting process is review the existing QAPs for the past couple of cycles, or if they've already released some sort of draft or preview to comment on. They publicly post those. They're somewhere on your state's HFA website, and it's really super critical to understand, well, what has the state required in the past? What do we think is actually already planned to be changed this time around? Is there something where we have, a little bit of a wedge in the door already that we can just push further because the HFA has shown some interest in doing this in the past? We just want to see more of it. Just understanding the specific details of what historically has already been in that program is going to be super helpful. Maybe not in figuring out what you would like to see, but if you have, you know, 5 or 6 things that you'd like to see changed, it might help you figure out which are the 2 or 3 that you really want to push first, because it seems like there might be an opening to go do that. And then once you kind of understand the lay of the land a little bit, you're going to want to start developing that strategy in more detail. You're going to, again, start thinking with your partners, well, what would make the greatest impact toward our shared goals? What is most likely to get traction with the HFA or the developers that they're listening to? Some tips within that, use active language like create, require, or allocate to try to give some actual specific directions of things you would like the HFA to do rather than just sort of passive. It would be good if, this was a little bit better. Try to have that kind of more direct active language, aiming for some gradual improvements. So just from our past experience, if it's something that hasn't been required in the state's QAP in the past, it's very unlikely that it's going to become a full-on requirement out of nowhere in the program. So if they haven't even addressed, renewable energy on projects in the past, they're probably not going to require solar panels on the roof of every project in the next QAP. But they might be open to giving a point or a small basis boost for projects that do it. And once you, again, have kind of established that first point, that's going to give you something to build off of the next time around. Like, hey, you did this point, it was successful. We saw a few projects do it. It seems like it was beneficial to members. Should we up those points? Should we just make it a requirement from here on out? You can build on those gradual improvements. Make sure that you're explaining your reasoning, specifically any data or examples you have of how that recommendation is going to tie back to that mission of preserving affordable housing is critical. So, even though we have a whole host of reasons as a coalition why we would like to see these projects be decarbonized, not all of them are actually related to the core mission of the LIHTC program, right? But we emphasize the part of this is a way to keep utility bills low and keep housing affordable for the folks participate or that are eventually going to live in this housing. Use examples from other states, and this is where being part of a regional coalition like Midwest BDC can be helpful to have those case studies. It makes it easier for the HFA staff to add something new if they can just copy their neighbor's homework of how they put it into the QAP. And it also kind of puts them at ease of, oh, this did have a positive impact for tenants on projects when Minnesota did this. It's not some crazy out of nowhere idea. It can make them much more open to incorporating that. And then again, narrowing your recommendations to, 3 at most 5 actionable recommendations is really ideal, because yours are not the only comments that they'll be receiving, right? They will be hearing from a lot of the developers that participate in the program, maybe other community groups with competing priorities. So focusing very hard on 3 specific things rather than having a list of 10 or 12 things is again going to help your recommendations cut through and make them more likely to be acted on by the HFA. So once you've got that strategy developed, then you're going to want to format that into something nice and polite and professional for the HFA to look at and consider. Typically, they'll have a specific staff email or something like that that they want those comments to be submitted to. So make sure that you know the appropriate place to send and the deadline for that. And then make sure they have it. And then after that, don't let that be the end of your engagement with this program. Make sure you're watching for when that final QAP comes out so you can review the changes. Be looking for, okay, obviously you're looking for any of your recommendations that got fully adopted, but also there might be things where you didn't get exactly what you wanted, but it is a change from the previous year and it's still moving in the direction of what you recommended. Or, things that you recommended that didn't go anywhere this cycle. Make sure you have a handle on that. Make sure that you are following up with those relationships that you've started to cultivate at the HFA, just to say, hey, we appreciate the movement on this. That was really nice to see. Or, hey, we would love to have a conversation of, why you chose not to do this next year, just so we understand, if there's a better or more appropriate recommendation we could make the next time around. These commenting periods should not be isolated silos that we do once every year or every 2 years. They should just be a milestone in an ongoing conversation that we have about affordable housing in your state. And then I wanted to follow up or finish off with just a case study from how Midwest BDC has engaged with these programs. And I am based in Des Moines, so I promise that this was not picked out of home bias, but just because it's actively happening and was a good timely example to use for this training. But I wanted to talk a little bit about what our experience engaging with Iowa's QAP has been last year, and then now starting again this year. So going back to that slide of the states or that 50 state study of what's in some states QAPs, you probably noticed that Iowa wasn't one of the ones that had a green building certification requirement or all electric language or renewable language or anything like that. They're a pretty middle of the road to more conservative QAP for the region. And they are an annual one. So we have 2 years back to back that we can compare. So last year around this time, we came to the Iowa Finance Authority with 6 recommendations. And I'll wait for somebody in the chat to call me out for that being more than 3 to 5 recommendations. But they were improve the requirements for energy assessments or audits before project design for projects that were a major rehabilitation, giving more points or basis boost for projects that receive green building certifications. And we had a whole host of data to point to these certifications and require higher levels of energy efficiency. This is how this is going to positively impact the tenants of these projects. We requested a requirement that new construction projects be at least electrification ready, and then award points for electrification, and talked about the inflationary and volatile nature of natural gas and other heating fuel prices in Iowa, the health impacts associated with having gas appliances in these units and things like that as the justification for that. We did talk about creating incentives for on-site or community solar. At the time, IRA was still pretty fresh, especially the new and expanded tax credits. So we talked about wanting them to coordinate and align the QAP with the requirements for some of these other tax credits. And then the sixth one was a very specific one for Iowa. They created a new program last year that took some of their allocation out of the regular competitive application process and created this innovation set aside, which was a separate competitive contest um, that was scored differently than their regular QAP. They had a panel of judges that judged presentations from developers for any project that the developers deemed innovative in some way, whether that be something in the building design itself or including certain types of services or something like that. It was very broad. So we had some thoughts on what they should be telling that panel of judges to really zero in on with that. So we had this whole host of things. We went to their preview meeting and gave comments with these. We submitted a whole written letter with all of these. What did we actually get? I will say on the surface, maybe not that much. The two things that we did get, the only one was like an actual official thing in the QAP, and that was that the first draft that Iowa had removed some of the energy efficiency points that they had in 2023. IFA Iowa Finance Authority had said, well, everybody was getting those points anyway, so it was just kind of housekeeping. We're just going to take them out, which we pushed back on, saying if everybody's getting them, the answer isn't to take them out, it's to increase the threshold needed to get the points and keep encouraging folks to do more. And they didn't increase the threshold, but they did keep it in to at least like keep the door open. So that was a little bit of a small win. And then when the final version came out, as some side comments, the Iowa Finance Authority staff had said, hey, we're interested in looking at green building certifications in the future. It just didn't make it in this year. So, one kind of small defensive win and some vague language about things. At the time, a little bit disappointing, but this is where I come back to, don't think of all of these comment periods as one fight on their own. It is an ongoing conversation, because now over the past couple of weeks, Iowa Finance Authority is previewing what they're looking at for changes for the 2025 program, and we've started engaging with that. And what we see so the screenshots on the left are from the 2-page preview that Iowa Finance Authority put out 2 weeks ago there. And then they had a meeting earlier this week to get feedback on that and have some discussion. Well, now what do we see? Now on their own, Iowa Finance Authority is proposing a new basis boost for green certified projects, and had a whole 10-minute discussion, or 10-15-minute discussion at their preview meeting with developers, talking about should we be including other green certifications in that basis boost? Should we have tiers with higher levels of basis boost? Like, what's going to make this more useful? Really exciting. They're addressing their energy efficiency requirements again. This time, they're not talking about taking them out. They're talking about, well, how do we make this simpler for the developers while maintaining high energy efficiency requirements? What if we just reference Energy Star and be done with it? That's going to make it easier for everybody. And that opens the door for a whole host of other recommendations that we had last year, but now they're going to be part of, hey, how do we build on what you're already planning to doing, rather than being some completely new thing. Also, there was a long discussion at that meeting this week about, hey, how many of our projects are already all electric without us having a requirement? Let's get you numbers on that so we can see what that percentage actually is. Maybe we do need points for all electric, or maybe that's already happening and it makes sense to focus on something else. But I wanted to go through this case study because I think it was very exciting and demonstrative of those incremental changes do build on each other. Those conversations, even if you don't get everything you want one cycle, if you keep being a presence in the program, do move those things forward. And now we're seeing, a fairly conservative state government moving forward with building decarb related items in their program. So I guess I'll leave it on that like semi optimistic, hopeful note of if you're engaging with this program in your state and you don't feel like you're getting anywhere right now, sometimes it's like that jar lid that won't come off, and somebody just worked it long enough for the next person to come along and it spins off real easy. Sometimes that's how it goes with engaging with these programs. Finally, I know we're towards the end of our hour here, just talking briefly about getting involved. I alluded to our standing working group here at Midwest BDC that meets every month. It's the third Tuesday of each month at 4:30 Eastern or 3:30 Central. We track all of these state programs. We talk together. We talk about what's happening in each other's states and what we can learn and bring to the next state and do better. Shout out to Madeline McCullough from National Housing Trust, who helps me facilitate that working group every month and does a lot of work in the background between meetings as well. So if you're a Midwest BDC member on the call who isn't engaged with that working group yet, reach out. We'll get you locked in. If you're not a member yet, but this sounds appealing to you, let's talk about becoming a member so we can get you locked into that resource. And then again, even if you're on your own or you're out somebody seeing this training that's outside of our footprint, again, we do have that QAP toolkit on our website in the resources section for you to look at. And so I will stop there. I know I ran all the way up to the end of our hour, but if there were any questions before we ended here today, I'm happy to answer what I can. If folks either want to raise their hand or put something in that Q&A. Great, give me 1 second and I will pull up the link to our membership page so you can see that, Mary Alice. So there's the link to that membership tab there. And then while I've got that open, I will link to that toolkit as well for those of you on the webinar right now. There is the link to that PDF toolkit that I referenced as part of this conversation. All right, well, I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat or hands up. So I will say, again, if you had other questions or things you wanted to follow up on, please reach out to us at Midwest BDC. We'd love to talk to you, and hopefully this has been helpful and educational to you on this specific program and how it intersects with our goals. Thank you, everybody. Oh, I do see it. So primarily that 9% program, Mary Alice, is for new builds or major rehabilitation projects. There is another tax credit program that has to do with like acquiring existing housing and converting it to low-income housing. That's also under the banner of LIHTC, but it's a little bit separate program from what we talked about today. Right. Thanks, everybody.